are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm awesome now after this presentation.
Oh, that's very kind of you. That's great. Thank you for having me. This is exciting. Well, thanks everyone, and I hope you can see that screen there. Um, I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to talk about how this kind of presents a moment, this moment in time that we're in, where governments can't let this situation go to waste, and how they can use this concept of a crisis to move forward and kind of create exponential growth. And there's a few things I want to consider today. The first one is the current situation. And of course, country to country, that situation will be different. It'll be more nuanced in some areas versus others. But I feel like as a globe, we haven't seen something like this before, where we're all, regardless of our pre-existing conditions, our pre-existing leanings politically, we all find ourselves in a relatively similar situation. So I want to discuss that. And then I want to discuss for a few minutes what I think our role is. And then I want to talk about very tactical things, especially when we're talking about digital and digital campaigning and digital marketing. What are some of the things we can do going forward? So let's start with the first part, which is a current and evolving situation. And at the heart of any government response are a few things that I'm currently noticing. And I hope that we can kind of see this play out regardless of where you are, that is relatively universalized. The first thing I'd say is that in this current COVID era where we're dealing with this crisis, money is cheap. What I mean by that is that government spending is at unprecedented levels in many countries. This concept of austerity has thrown itself out the window. And wherever there were capitalists, in any case, everyone is now becoming some version of a socialist, saying that we need government support, we need a social safety net, we need to be able to have programs and services delivered, especially when people can't go to work or they've lost their jobs, which has now meant that money is cheap. Governments aren't afraid to go into debt, governments aren't afraid to spend. Secondly, the rope is long. What I mean by that is that the leeway that governments have right now in a pandemic is much, much greater than it would be in normal times. The third thing here is that policies are moving fast. I speak here from Canada, where we put in an emergency employment program for people who had lost their jobs because of the crisis within 2 weeks. In normal times, that would have taken 6 months to a year, no doubt. So we find ourselves in a very unique situation where policies are moving fast. You're also seeing that there's a push for a new normal, that there are individuals saying, let's not let this crisis go to waste. Let's not just go back to the status quo of how our society was governed, how we did things. Let's establish a new normal. We're also seeing two final sort of pillars, I believe I should call them. The first one is a deceleration in certain changes. And what I mean by that is that the COVID pandemic has accelerated some of the trends that we have seen. It's accelerated the trend of automation. It's accelerated and exposed the trend of how gig workers, people who deliver food or drive Ubers or whatever that may be, we're seeing that their trend that is either for or against them has been accelerated. So the government response right now is about decelerating some of those trends so that they can have time to figure out the right policy solutions to protect vulnerable workers, to ensure that those who lose their jobs through automation have, additional skills they can build to get another job. So the government really will want to decelerate certain versions of change. And finally, what I'll say and what I alluded to is that as societies across the world in varying countries, we are seeing the concept of societal and communal values, especially in how we respond to a public health pandemic. These values are starting to emerge in greater order than we've seen before. So all of this cocktail of things that I've just presented provides us with this concept that the government has cloud cover. The government is now able to, and governments across the world are now able to, because of these unbelievably unique set of circumstances on the recovery of COVID, are now able to do things that they would never have been before. And that's a very unique moment. So as much as though we are struggling, we are suffering, we are in a crisis, we are also presented with this unbelievable intersection in our modern reality where governments have money that's cheap, rope that's long, policies that are fast moving, the call for a new normal, and more communal values. We are now finding ourselves in a very unique moment. So if you agree with that thesis, that governments have this crisis and they can't let it go to waste. They can't let it just go back to normal. What is our role? If we are as individuals feel like we want to push for a newer society, for a different society, even for a tweaked version of the existing society we live in, what does that look like? And I want to bring up this quote, which is a quote by former United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was president in the 1930s in the United States. And his famous quote was, "I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it." Let me say that again. I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is very simple. It's that he wanted a certain policy solution, but what he needed to justify it, what he needed to have as the rationale for doing it was mass public support, was for people to mobilize and say, we want, a basic income. We want a minimum wage. We want certain rights instituted. So we find ourselves in a very similar moment. Many of our home governments will probably want to create versions of social change going forward, but they will need us as individuals, as marketers, as advocates, as campaigners, as those looking to push the boundaries of society to create that justification. So how do we kind of think about that and how do we do it? Well, there's 4 things I want to talk about. Number 1, everyone is an influencer. In the modern reality that we find ourselves in, everyone has a circle of influence. We know that based on how we shop, how we buy, how we vote, how we donate to charity, that the most trusted sources are not centralized institutions. It's not millions of dollars in advertising. Those things help. But the basic source of influence and trust are people that are around us, our friends, our family, and people that we want to be like. And so everyone now has a small base, 12, 15, 50 people that they have a disproportionate amount of influence on. That's a new sort of reality of the modern infrastructure. And if we want to change government policy, we need to understand that, having centralized institutions and campaigns just pushing a message simply is not enough. We need to understand that everyone that we know, everyone that we bring in is a node of influence. The second thing is everyone's a media company. So not only is everyone an influencer, everyone has a social account that they can then broadcast and create content that creates disproportionate support. We are also realizing that supporters are the new oxygen. If you're pushing, let's say, for a universal basic income in your country, to have people that support you, to have their email address, their phone number, their contact information directly, is the new oxygen. This is where we create list growth. This is where we create assets. This is how we push through in that change. We create a campaign based on the individual, not based on the centralized institution and branding. And finally, we're seeing that campaign brands are built to engage on specific topics. We're seeing more and more that the introduction of new campaign brands, regardless of who the sponsoring organization is, to advocate and articulate certain asks and policy. So even though the sponsoring organization for a campaign might be, an organization that advocates for hunger, you might have a new campaign brand. You might have a new campaign name and tagline that is introduced to create that very specific awareness of what you're trying to do. So in the world where we want to instill that change, and we're now seeing that campaigns are brands, everyone's an influencer, supporters are the new oxygen, we now present ourselves with an opportunity of how we can tactically build that change. And when we think about how we tactically want to build that change, there's a few things I want to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is this concept of the actual tactics. But the second is, how do we position them? And there's several things we can do, especially in the digital space. We can build campaigns. We can create content and video. We can, promote content. And I think all of those things apply. But there's 4 basic things I wanted to cover that I think are really important. The first one is list building. Nothing is more important to allow the government, to allow civil society, to allow political actors to justify their decision than for you as individuals and as individuals who want to create that change to build a list. What do I mean by that? Well, going back to that Franklin D. Roosevelt quote, when he said, "I agree with you, I just want to be forced to do it," what it ultimately means is that governments, regardless of where they are in the world, have one thing in common, which is they need public support for the actions that they are taking. So if they don't see that there is mass public support for what they want to do, they won't do it. So what our job is going to be, especially in this unique moment in time, is to build the list of people, that we can then take to government, that we can showcase to government and say, these are the hundreds or thousands of people that would agree and celebrate your policy decision if you were to make it. That's the justification our governments need. The second thing I want to mention is something called relational campaigning. And relational campaigning is very much rooted in what I was talking about earlier, where I say everyone is an influencer. Many of the political campaigns and advocacy campaigns in the States and Canada and places in Europe as well have now taken this concept on and saying, how do we find the most hyper-engaged individuals in our campaign and give them a disproportionate amount of control on the campaign? So they're not just individuals who come in and support, they are individuals who are their own campaign managers, who have their own network of trust, who are then going out and recruiting other people because of the disproportionate level of trust that those people have in them. So it is utilizing this concept of influence and trust, even with normal people, and especially with normal people, and saying, you are now responsible for mobilizing people in your network. You are now responsible for bringing more people into this campaign. And I think that's the key of how we need to work. The third thing is polling and PR. I know you've had a lot of sessions here talking about things like guerrilla PR. This is just a natural extension of that with one nuance, which is how do we now think about this concept of polling to showcase that there is mass public support and then using PR and free media and earned media to get that out there. And what we find is that plus relational campaigning and list building is unbelievably important and impressive. And here's the last thing I'll leave you with, which is do-it-yourself campaigns and branding. As we look to start to get governments to consider new decisions, to consider campaigns, allowing people on your campaign to take your brand, to extrapolate that brand, to make it their own, to have do-it-yourself content that you provide. So window signs that they can put up in their windows so you don't have to pay for costs. Super tactical things like that, Facebook share images, all those things that you then tell these people who you've brought in that are the hyper-engaged supporters in your campaign, that this is for you. You are the insiders. We can't do this without you. And because of that, we've created this inside sort of track where we're going to provide you with this content. That is seeming to work really, really well. So in summary, we find ourselves at an unbelievable moment in time. We find ourselves in a moment where governments want to act. They've got the rope to act. They've got the leverage to make big decisions that will ultimately be able to change how we think about democracy, how we think about everyday life and policy. It is going to be incumbent on us, and especially us with skills and interest in digital marketing, campaigning, strategy, scenario planning. It is then incumbent on us to be at the core of what this looks like going forward. So Arthur, I'll leave it there and happy to kind of chat further if there's any questions.